Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. I wanted to talk a little bit about the two Shaft sequels following the original iconic 1971 film. These films are rarely discussed, if ever mentioned, outside of even the briefest inclusions of material talking about the original film. And since Criterion decided to include the Warner Archive transfer of the first sequel, Shaft's Big Score, in their 4K UHD package of the special edition they made for the original film, I went back and, of course, rewatched Shaft's Big Score and Shaft in Africa to rewatch the entire trilogy. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the two sequels that are really kind of overlooked and rarely ever discussed, and also a little bit about their releases on video, particularly also doing a review of the Warner Archive disc releases of both films, which are the way to see them on video with beautiful new transfers made specifically for them. So MGM had a huge hit on their hands with the original 1971 film, and of course decided, as anybody would, to try and immediately put a sequel into the works. So this is what resulted in Shaft's Big Score coming out the next year in 1972. And I think the idea was to basically get another film in the same mold with the same cast and crew out to the market as soon as humanly possible. Of course, back in the early 70s, you could still do that and have a film come out the very next year. Now the thought of having a sequel come out a year or slightly less than a year after the original has premiered and become a success is unthinkable. So that's always incredible to see how that used to be pulled off. Shaft's Big Score reunites Gordon Parks as director with star Richard Roundtree returning to reprise his iconic role as John Shaft. And it is very much a continuation of a lot of things from the original film. However, since the original film was a great hit, they did have more money to play around with, and there is a definite sense of it feels more relaxed than the original film. The first thing you're going to notice right off the bat is this is a scope film. So both the sequels are in scope 235, unlike the original being in spherical 185. So that automatically makes this feel more of a premium experience, and that they had more money because it's actually in scope. But outside of that, we are in the same sort of world. This is also being based on an Ernest Tidyman novel, who of course created the character of John Shaft and would go on to also work on the screenplay for this film. So this is still rooted in the literary Shaft that Tidyman created and the sort of grounded, grittier, this is a tale still set in New York, so still John Shaft on his home turf, and it's been expanded upon from the original film. However, the thing you're also going to immediately notice, and I think the reason why the sequels often get passed over, the second film, you can definitely get the sense of, okay, this is more of what we got in the first film, but it doesn't ever reach that same iconic status. It doesn't. You still get some of the time capsule flavor, particularly in when we're seeing footage of New York. There's a really impressive moment where all of a sudden the villain is coming in over New York itself in a helicopter, and the camera's actually inside the helicopter cabin as they go to land on top on a rooftop. It's a really striking visual and a really wonderful moment because you get this actual bird's eye perspective of New York in 1972. Something that's a really interesting moment because, of course, that particular version of the New York skyline did not last very long, and it's amazing to see that in a lovely new HD scan. It really helped the film come to life more. But you also don't get the same you never quite get the same level of grittiness as you do in the first film. It's not as grungy, and I think that in getting more money to play with and it being a scope film, I hate to say it almost has has a slight flavor of being more of a studio film in a sense. It's still got Gordon Parks' stamp on it. It still feels like a continuation of the first film, but it never gets to that same grunginess, and it never has the same immediacy to it. It's a very relaxed film. The plot, just as in the first film, is rather simple when we actually get to it. There's a lot of business between people putting up false fronts and once again having the usual or expected business of having ulterior motives and not operating out in the open with their true purposes. You need some degree of that in every detective story, but so it's similar to the original film in its plot a little bit, with Shaft dealing with various segments of the criminal underworld in New York, and basically having to navigate through and be a one-man sort of army. Here, you do get a greater emphasis on that one-man army type idea, particularly in the film's climax, which is probably the most famous thing about the film, is that the entire climax is a pretty much a singular action sequence that starts as a standoff, then becomes a car chase, and then eventually becomes John Shaft on foot with a rather wonderfully badass large assault rifle, or assault shotgun, I should say, still in the iconic leather jacket, versus a helicopter. And so it's this very long, multi-stage, extended action climax that is far beyond anything the meager budget of the first film could achieve. So, this is definitely one of those prime examples of a sequel getting to go bigger because they got more money to play with. But it's not necessarily a good thing all the time, because again, you never have the immediacy that you get in the first film. So, the Shaft's big score has a lot of the positives of the first film, for sure, but it has all of the negatives, and it doesn't have the tighter focus in terms of the runtime and the story. So Shaft's big score feels. It does feel a little bit slower, and it definitely repeats certain elements and ideas from the first film. So this is definitely a sequel that is more of a continuation. It's just, oh, well, if you wondered what happened when John Shaft woke up and got a new case basically thrust in his lap, 2 weeks later, it might look something like Shaft's big score. You also very quickly notice that the score is different, because Isaac Hayes did not return to score the film or make a new theme. There apparently was some contract dispute about the salary he was going to get, so that led to him being replaced. And interestingly, it's actually Gordon Parks himself who composes the score and is credited with the score. So here you have yet another aspect of the man's incredible talents, that he not only was a great photographer, a great artist, a poet, a director, but he could also do film scores, and Shaft's big score has a very good score. Part of the great attraction to the two sequels, and why it's a shame they're not discussed as often, is that they both have really well done scores, and they both have excellent themes. Here, the theme for Shaft's big score is another. It's a song very clearly inspired by the original Isaac Hayes theme from the original film, but it has an identity of its own. It's a little bit leaner. It's a little bit meaner, even. It definitely fits the tone the film is going for. And so this is a film that I think you can enjoy things in it. It's a fun experience. Yeah, when you see the original film, you do want more. So the idea of doing a Shaft sequel was perfectly justified, and it's great we actually got more of Richard Roundtree as the character, because he's absolutely fantastic. He is it is one of the iconic actor character links in your head. It's great that we got not just one but two sequels. But Shaft's big score of the three is the one that is I hate to say the words generic, but it is the one that is the technically the safest. It feels pretty much just like a continuation of the first film. So you do get some of that wonderful New York early 70s time capsule flavor, but again, it's never as gnarly. It's not quite as vivid as what we got in the first film. Again, with more money to play with, and the fact that it's in scope, it's a bit brighter. It's a bit more. It's definitely more polished overall. That even goes to the sound mix as well. And of course, when you get to the extended action climax, you can't even imagine them trying to do anything that elaborate in the first film. But that's a good point about what I'm talking about. Of just because it's more polished and more elaborate doesn't necessarily make it better, because the original did have an intensity factor. And if you've seen both films, if you think about the difference between the extended action climax of Shaft's big score compared to the ending of the original film, the ending of Shaft's big score is impressive for what it is, but it never builds to the intensity level of the ending of the first film, because we have the whole build up to that sequence where Shaft eventually has the iconic moment where he breaks through the window after throwing the flaming bit of newspaper and setting the room on fire, burst through the window on a rope to rescue the girl. So it's an iconic moment, and it has been built up to, and it's almost like when you have the moment in a heist film where everything's set in motion and it's very suspenseful and drawn out, and they have to infiltrate the building to then set up the multi-pronged attack. So not a lot of pyrotechnics or action going on in terms of an action sequence, but it's much more suspenseful and thus much more involving. Well, Shaft's big score, it's kind of the opposite. It's involving because it's extended, but it's also very extended, so you never get that immediacy factor. The engagement is much more from, that's actually Richard Roundtree running around the New York docks, and that's actually a helicopter really flying around, and it's all real for real, and it's impressive. For it being a film that, it had a bigger budget, but it didn't have a huge budget increase over the first film. So it's still a well-made, enjoyable film. It's a more enjoyable and fulfilling experience than you would think for a film like Shaft getting a sequel just a year later. I think that does have to do with bringing back the original team. It's still being Gordon Parks in the director's chair. You could have Richard Roundtree in this role simply doing nothing, and it would still be fascinating, and he'd still be the most badass person alive, and the definition of cool. So it's just great we got any more classic Shaft material in terms of any film or sequel. But of the three films, Shaft's big score is probably the most standard. And I think what helps it along is you still have Ernest Tidyman involved somehow, and it is based on one of his novels. So it does have some grounding in the literary character he created, and it does have some of the grittiness that we have in the first film. But the reason why it's never gotten that iconic status like the original is because you don't have Isaac Hayes doing the score. It's a bit more polished, so it doesn't have that full grungy iconography of the original. And the original was so groundbreaking that the fact that they did a sequel seems a no-brainer. So the sequel is never going to have that sort of that same level of attention grabbing as the original does. And that, combined with it's much more polished and it's not as immediate, and it still has some of the same inherent issues as the first film in terms of it being a very simple story, but now it's a bit longer, a bit stretched out more, and it's a bigger film. It sort of magnifies some of those inherent issues. So it's a much better film in conclusion than what you would think. And it's a fun film to come back to. And if you're going to rewatch the original film, you're going to want to rewatch the sequels anyway. So that's why I was happy to do so, because anytime I watch Shaft, I'm going to watch the other two films as well, which makes Shaft in Africa, the third and final film of the trilogy, released in 1973, the real outlier and a true surprise. you would expect the direct sequel in Shaft's big score with the same director coming back, being made directly after the first film. You would expect it to carry a lot of the same techniques and have a lot of the same strengths, which it does. But when you hear a title like Shaft in Africa and you know that Gordon Parks had nothing to do with this, this is where you start to think, okay, well, this has got to be terrible. This has got to be the exploitation in blaxploitation. This sounds like some crazy idea that MGM came up, that the studio decided they were going to try and exploit this franchise as much as possible now that they were producing a second sequel. So it would be fine to you would be right to think something like that just looking at the title or some of the advertising. But then you would be wrong if you wrote off the film and never saw it, because while it might be a little bit hokey in places, and it definitely is a early 70s film with a modest budget, but not a terribly high budget either, Shaft in Africa is actually a well-made little film. It's nothing like the first two films. It definitely throws John Shaft, the character, into a more straightforward action-adventure film that definitely takes him all over the world, so you have the globe-trotting aspects. It is... Some have labeled it trying to put John Shaft into more of a James Bond type plot. There is some truth to that, I think, but it's also it never goes fully over the top. It's not as elaborate as a Bond plot would get, so you do have some of the feeling of that. It's definitely throwing John Shaft into a different type of plot scenario. But it is grounded enough, and I think that is entirely due to the primary creative personnel behind it. Shaft in Africa was written by Sterling Siliphant, who, of course, also wrote In the Heat of the Night, and his inspiration was the emergence of news stories about human trafficking that was still going on in the slave trade that still existed in the early 1970s. So the film did have an important meaning and message behind it as its impetus for coming into being. But it was directed by John Gillerman, who, could make a really strong on-location action picture. This is the man who made Tarzan's Greatest Adventure, one of the greatest later Tarzan films. He could make a two-fisted adventure film on location, and of course he would be picked to do the Dino De Laurentiis 1976 remake of King Kong. Probably his best film overall is probably the 1978 version of Death on the Nile, which also involves lots of location work and really makes that film all the more effective. So he's actually the perfect choice for this film. Now, the plot setup is a bit different, so I will discuss it a little bit. Shaft's big score is very straightforward and very similar to a lot of things you see in the first film that you don't really have to talk about the plot all that much. Whereas Shaft in Africa has a whole setup of essentially being introduced to this human trafficking ring, and then John Shaft is essentially chosen and recruited into becoming the new, essentially the new penetration agent for the rulers and government officials of this African country to try and infiltrate and smash the human trafficking ring that operates on a multinational scale. And it's sort of the old trope of trying to figure out who is the perfect person, perfectly suited to tackle a case that seems impossible, and then it somehow becomes our particular hero, whether it's a private detective or spy. Think of the famous opening of Armand Flint, for example, or how Harry Palmer is selected by the supercomputer in Billion Dollar Brain to be the operative of choice. Same sort of idea here, so that's sort of, again, tying it to the world of spy films. So the opening, the way it's handled, and the fact that this is a film that is shot not really, I don't think, at in Hollywood on a studio lot. It's I think they did most of the studio work that's in the film. As I want to say it was in France. It definitely has a different look to it. And when you see this film, the opening is it's a little hokey. It's okay, but it definitely sticks out from the rest of the film. The whole opening sequences, it's just set up to get Shaft to go into Africa and pose as just being a normal guy walking around who would be gullible enough to get sucked up into the human trafficking ring, so then he can expose it at every turn. You can see that there are some good ideas here, and that the film does have good intentions, and that it is going to go somewhere, and that automatically makes it more palatable instead of just going in and it being a generic film, or an obviously something that would be labeled very clearly a blaxploitation film. But once you get past the opening setup of Shaft being recruited, once we actually get to Africa and we get to the actual all the location work, that's where the film really takes off, and it really starts to move, and it's got good energy to it. And this is where you can see very clearly this was directed by John Gillerman, because if you've seen any of his films where it's a jungle film, or one of his Tarzan films, or even the De Laurentiis remake of King Kong, you can get that sense of, okay, this is the same guy. This is the same guy who made Death on the Nile. This is where the film's at its strongest, and it does give Richard Roundtree something different to do. So he always maintains the character throughout, even when Shaft is having to pretend to be someone he's not. He's always got the same iconic badassery, the same coolness, but he also is able to display much more of Shaft as detective, Shaft as secret agent, as undercover operative, and every single moment of his characterization is on point, and he never loses that focus. Shaft is never swallowed up into a completely different film. So it's Roundtree's performance and his maintaining of the Shaft character throughout, that's the anchor point for the film. If you messed around with that, or if that was ever lost, this would no longer feel like a sequel to the first two films. My only real criticism of how Shaft is presented here is probably in the opening sequences. If you look closely at how he's dressed, all of a sudden he's dressed in much more fancy clothes, and it just doesn't really jibe with your mental picture of how John Shaft presents himself and his own personal taste, because it clashes with the styles that he had in the first two films. And I think that's because, of course, Gordon Parks was no longer around to direct and put his own stamp on things. But that's very minor, because you only see that for really just a scene or two in the opening sequence, because most of the film is on location. That's another reason why I think you get a nice hard jarring distinction between all the opening stuff that just gets us to the main part of the story in and on location. The location work is very, very well done. You get that you are there sense, and it's really Richard Roundtree walking around and going into all kinds of areas that you just were not going to see in a major studio film. It doesn't beat around the bush in showing that there are all different types of social cultures in existence, and as Shaft goes along, we see all kinds of different villages, and then we go to different countries, and we wind up finishing the film in France at the end of the pipeline. So if you want to link this to any sort of Bond material, it's very much similar to Diamonds Are Forever, particularly Fleming's original novel, where Bond is simply trying to smash a diamond smuggling ring, and he has to go along the various stages of the pipeline. You get some of that in the film adaptation still, but if you wanted to put Shaft in Africa in any sort of Bond comparison, it would have to be Diamonds Are Forever. The other interesting thing is pretty much Shaft's cover is blown before he even starts, and so at every turn he's having to defend himself and think quickly on his feet and just barely manage to survive, so that it adds nice tension and danger and suspense elements. And of course, being John Shaft, he's not going to simply give up, even though he probably should. So he keeps going anyway. There's other interesting bits in the film. There's some nice action sequences that are very gritty and very low key, but very very befitting of the scenario that the film is presenting. So once again, I think that this being directed by John Gillerman is what really makes it work, because he does provide a nice, he maintains a raw sense of energy throughout, and that's why the best sequences are all the ones in Africa, which is the bulk of the film. The grittiness is maintained throughout, even when we get to France at the end. It's still very low key. This is a low key story still, even though we're going for a more globe-trotting approach. There is the requisite amount of love interests, and then there is the requisite amount of humor, but a bit more humor definitely than what we see in the first two films. It's more obvious and overt humor, and then the inclusion of a few sex scenes like we have in the first two films, but here they are very much just there for the sort of titillating factor, and they definitely have the flavor of being more like a Bond film love scene or an action adventure film love scene. So again, you can make all kinds of connections. It is very plainly obvious that they were trying to transition the Shaft films into being more like a traditional action adventure series or a Bond film. So that's the feeling it's trying to go for a bit more. It does have a bit more money to play with than the first two films, but again, not terribly much more. So you do still have the feeling of it has a lowish budget, but this is made up for by the fact that there's all this location footage, and it is quite vivid, and it is, Africa in the 70s and France in the 70s, so it does feel like a slightly different world, obviously, to what we have today, and it's topped off by a really incredible score by Johnny Pate, who did the score, and it has a phenomenal theme entitled "Are You Man Enough," which is done by the Four Tops, and that'll definitely get stuck in your head. It's a fantastic theme, but the theme and the score, like the film, is very distinctly its own thing compared to the first two films. It's nothing like the iconic Isaac Hayes score. It's nothing like the theme to Shaft's big score. So the film, its score, and its theme do stand alone as their own separate identity. Overall, it's the more you come back to it, it wins you over more. It's definitely unexpected when you see it for the first time that it's a much better film than the very blaxploitation, admittedly, title would lead you to believe. It's a film with actually good intentions and about real world problems and ideas, and it manages to form a very interesting third film in this trilogy. It's not a perfect film by any means. It's not a great film, but it's a surprisingly satisfying one. And it does have humor and has bits of fun, and you can see them taking the Shaft character into a different realm and trying to play around with things and see what works. So in that sense, it's actually more interesting than the second film, which does repeat a lot of the first film because it's really more of a continuation. So the Shaft's big score is sort of the glue between the first and third films. It's like a growth or continuation of the same material and approach of the first film. And so in that sense, of the two sequels, because it's more interesting, because it tries some different things, I think Shaft in Africa is actually the stronger of the two sequels. Simply because it's trying some new things and has some drive to it. Yes, it's a little hokey in places. Yes, it's a little silly and wacky in some ways. But you have over the top, interesting, wacky, silly bits, like of course the villain in sort of a Bond villain mold has the woman on his arm who just also happens to be a complete nymphomaniac. So of course, what does she want to do but bed John Shaft at some point, and that does happen. So you get very Very 70s aspects in this film. It has some silliness, but it's far more impressive than what you go in thinking it's going to be, and it does have some interesting and real world ideas behind it. So it's not an empty film. It's not a film simply trying to exploit a certain market, which is why they coined the term blaxploitation. And Richard Roundtree is again so fantastic in the role. It's a shame that MGM decided after this point to not do another film, and they basically gave up. And then Shaft went to television in the short-lived and rather ill-advised television series where you have Richard Roundtree playing Shaft, but it's having to live within the constraints of television censorship in the early 70s. So most, if not all, the grit of the first two films is gone, and it's nowhere near as globe-trotting as Shaft in Africa. So I've only seen one or two episodes of it, but it definitely is. It's kind of weird suddenly seeing John Shaft in a television show without any of I guess you could say without a lot of the Shaft-isms and the things we know, love, and expect from the character just suddenly being gone because it's suddenly a television show in the 70s. And then after that point, that was really all that happened with the character outside of the 6 novels that Ernest Tidyman wrote, which are unfortunately out of print, and that's why I haven't read them yet. But I really do want to check them out because it's apparently a very different rendering of the character of the novels, which are supposed to be a lot darker and a lot more two-fisted and just really gritty, even in comparison to the first film. The Shaft in Africa, though, it's a really interesting film. Both films are worth your time. I will say that there is perhaps one point in Shaft in Africa that might slightly disturb some viewers. It's one small bit of what seems like maybe a bit of animal cruelty. It threw me the first time I saw the film. But now that I've seen it again and I've looked at it more closely, I think I can tell what they did. It's not as bad, quite as bad as it looks, but it's definitely something that you are not going to see on any ASPCA certified film. But to elaborate a little bit, so you know what I'm talking about. At one point, while Shaft is going around in Africa, he runs into a stray dog who follows him around for a little bit, and you get this amusing image of John Shaft walking around, but there's a little dog following at his heels. But shortly thereafter, the dog is killed by an evildoer, and leads to an actually really well staged quarterstaff or stick fight. But it's cut so quickly, and that it looks like the dog has actually been harmed. But I think what they did is they actually just sedated the dog and put some fake blood on him, and then later on, Shaft is carrying the supposedly dead dog. So of course, you wouldn't really have films sedating animals today. So that's the one bit I do like to mention if people haven't seen it before. If you are very sensitive to moments of even suggested animal cruelty, then that might throw you a little bit. But again, I don't think they actually did anything other than there's a cutaway, and I think what they did was they just sedated the dog, so the dog is asleep, but he's got some fake blood on his head. So when you examine it closely, you can kind of figure out what they did. But I do like to mention that for anyone who hasn't seen the film before, because the first time you see it, it's cut so fast you think something has actually happened. But again, it's definitely something that you would not have happen on an ASPCA certified shoot ever, or really ever should do. But it was the early 70s in another country, so I don't think it had the same, unfortunately, the same protections in place. Nevertheless, both films are surprisingly engaging experiences. They are interesting follow-ups to the original film, and it's a shame that they stopped after 3 films, because they could have gone to some different places. And I've always wished that there was at least something else where Richard Roundtree got to return to the character outside of we eventually got the cameo in the 2000 film, and then we got the 2019 film with the sort of multi-generational approach. But that film's more of a comedy. We never really got another bit outside of the television series of a more, serious John Shaft in his prime. So there was a possibility of maybe doing something with a fourth film, getting back to the more grounded first two films approach. But overall, it's an underrated pair of sequels, I think. And anytime people talk about the original film, and if I can bring up the sequels and they haven't seen them, I always like to encourage people to check them out because they are very interesting and they have interesting strengths to them that you wouldn't quite expect going in. Now, the sequels have not had nearly as much discussion or distribution or availability as the original film, so they were quite obscure for a long time. I had to wait to see them when I was growing up. I saw the original film many times, and I had to wait until I found them on DVD, and back then, those were nowhere near as available as the original film. So it was a nice surprise in 2019 when Warner Archive did new scans for Blu-ray of the two sequels. They sold them separately, and then they also made this lovely trilogy set, which includes the original Warner Brothers studio disc of the first film. And this definitely shows you the difference between an old or standard Warner studio disc and the work the Warner Archive puts in. Because the sequels received brand new scans from Master Materials, beautiful disc encoding jobs, original poster artwork, original trailers, and the original mono mixes for both in lossless DTS HDMA, and with maxed out bit rates. So they wiped the floor with the disc for the first film. So I've been bemoaning ever since, why can't the original finally get a good release? And of course, we finally got that on the new Criterion release. So this is a very affordable way to get both sequels. Again, both are brand new scans in full 1080p HD from Master Materials done in-house by Warner Archive. I would presume they were from the original negative or original interpositives. Both films are in scope, so they do have that similarity, only the first film is in 185. They both are dramatic improvements over the pretty ancient snapper case DVDs, which are actually flipper discs with a pan and scan version on the other side. They both are so dramatically improved in picture and sound that you really you don't have to ever hang on to these snapper cases. There's no reason to. In terms of the transfer for each, they both are pretty much the same in terms of they are amazing improvements. Beautiful new scans, maxed out bit rates from the archive, the usual archive sort of broken record. All their releases are like this, to the same technical standard of excellence for Blu-ray releases. The only things I noticed in both films is there's a tiny amount of frame wobble in the titles, which is typical for most films, and then maybe one or two other spots of a little frame movement here and there, and then there's a stray speck of dust or a stray small mark that manages to pop up here and there across the entirety of both transfers. That's really all you're going to see come up in these. These are lovely film element scans, beautifully presented with just some very slight natural age-related wear and source-related wear poking through in terms of only the slightest bit of maybe a little tiny bit of frame movement here and there. And again, a stray speck of dust or a stray mark that might come through just barely in a small spot. So these are incredible ways to see these films, and they will make your experience all the more enjoyable because you can look at a beautiful Warner Archive presentation of each. Since they are archive titles, they don't really have anything in terms of extras, but the archive did go the extra mile in including both original trailers. And not just that, they could have done like most people and included an old standard def copy. They have included brand new HD scans of both original trailers, so you get the bonus of having the original trailer in HD, and they look quite nice, and you get to compare to the film transfer. So that's another lovely touch. I love that they used the original artwork, but of course, this being the trilogy release, you get the images for all three, and this is a lovely, very affordable trilogy pack. It's just the 3 discs inside. You can see the difference very clearly between the generic old studio disc and the Warner Archive discs with the original poster artwork. So you can get them all separately, but the Trilogy pack is frequently on sale online. You can get this for sometimes $15 or less. So this is definitely the way to go, because the other benefit is having the studio disc for the first film. Included in the extras is one of the Shaft television episodes. So if you were curious about sampling that series, which is available in its entirety from the Warner Archive as a DVD release, but if you're curious about sampling it, you can throw on the studio disc of the original film, and that is included in the extras. So Criterion decided to include Shaft's big score as part of the extras to the deluxe 4K package of the original film. They did utilize Warner Archive's transfer, so it is the same master and presentation and audio as what's on the Warner Archive disc. The difference is in the encoding, because Criterion has not been doing very well with their disc encodes in the recent past few years, and unfortunately, even though it's the same master and presentation, it's not encoded as well, and it's not a fair comparison, really, because Warner Archive does the best encoding of any U.S. label in terms of their Blu-rays. So this is a case where you pick up the Criterion release, you get the great extras and the beautiful release of the first film, but you definitely want the Warner Archive release of the Shaft's big score to get the maximum amount of quality available. When you compare the two, they look pretty similar because it's the same master, so most people probably aren't going to notice a difference, but if you do compare them closely, you can actually visibly see the archive disc is actually better because it's better encoded. The other difference here is the mono is encoded as dual mono DTS HDMA, whereas on the Criterion, it's just encoded as single channel PCM mono, but it's the same mono track. Unfortunately, Criterion skipped Shaft in Africa entirely. I guess they wanted to stick with just the Gordon Parks directed films. So you do really need the Warner Archive disc for Shaft in Africa, which is an underrated, kind of forgotten sequel, and a very interesting one, if imperfect. And so I think that's why the Trilogy set is a great way to go, because it's very inexpensive. You get all three films in one place, and I think this makes the perfect supplement to the Criterion release. The other notable thing is Criterion did include a vintage on-set featurette shot during the making of Shaft's big score, which is a must-watch if you watch the film. So that's what you really want to get the Criterion in terms of Shaft's big score materials for. However, the trailer on the Criterion is just up-converted from an old standard def file and looks pretty gnarly. And here on the archive release, you have a beautiful HD version of the trailer. So there's another sort of trade-off. Criterion has the lovely featurette from the with on-set footage, and Warner Archive has the original trailer actually in HD. So again, I do think you need both releases. And since they are actually not very, the Criterion isn't very expensive, particularly when it's on sale, and the archive set is very cheap, they go hand in hand on the shelf. So if you have one, you need the other. The Criterion release of Shaft has all the amazing extras in terms of the very plentiful extras package, and then you need the archive set for the two sequels, really, and their presentation. And so that's why I wanted to talk at least somewhat about the sequels, because they are underrated, and I think they are good fun, and they definitely, if you're going to rewatch the iconic original film, you do need to dive back into the sequels for at least more of Richard Roundtree as the iconic John Shaft. So those are my brief thoughts on the two Shaft sequels, Shaft's Big Score and Shaft in Africa, which are very rarely discussed and actually quite interesting in a number of ways, and thus I think are must-owns from the Warner Archive and their lovely releases, which are, again, very affordable, especially if you decide to just get this trilogy set to go along with the Criterion release of the original film. So if you love the sequels or enjoy them as much as I do, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. It's always fun to be able to talk about the sequels because you rarely get the chance to, because so few people have seen them, and I get their scores stuck in my head all the time. They both have great scores and themes, and I just loved getting to rewatch them on these beautiful Warner Archive discs, because I never thought in a million years these would get a Blu-ray. So these are perfect titles to try out from the Warner Archive. They are beautiful disc releases and very affordable. So I think they are an essential companion piece to the Criterion release of the original film. I hope you have at least found my babblings about classic films and physical media releases at least somewhat fun and informative. And as I always say, please do keep supporting both studio and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep physical media and film culture alive. And thank you ever so much for watching.